The People Power Revolution was a series of popular demonstrations in the Philippines that began in 1983 and culminated on February 22–25, 1986. The methods used amounted to a sustained campaign of civil resistance against regime violence and electoral fraud. This case of non-violent revolution led to the departure of President Ferdinand Marcos and the restoration of the country's democracy. It is also referred to as the Yellow Revolution due to the presence of yellow ribbons during the demonstrations following the assassination of Filipino Senator Benigno Aquino, Jr. It was widely seen as a victory of the people against the 20-year-running authoritarian, repressive regime of then-President Ferdinand Marcos and made news headlines as the revolution that surprised the world. The majority of the demonstrations took place on a long stretch of Epifanio de los Santos Avenue, more commonly known by its acronym EDSA, in Metro Manila from February 22–25, 1986, and involved over 2 million Filipino civilians, as well as several political, military, and including religious groups led by Cardinal Jaime Sin, the Archbishop of Manila, and the CBCP President Cardinal Ricardo Vidal, the Archbishop of Cebu. The protests, fueled by the resistance and opposition from years of corrupt governance by Marcos, culminated with the departure of the dictator from Malacanang Palace to the state of Hawaii. Corazon Aquino was proclaimed as the legitimate president of the Philippines after the revolution. Background and history. Ferdinand E. Marcos was elected president in 1965, defeating incumbent Diosdado Macapagal by a very slim margin. During this time, Marcos was very active in the initiation of public works projects and the intensification of tax collections. Marcos and his government claimed that they built more roads than all his predecessors combined, and more schools than any previous administration. Amidst charges of vote buying and a fraudulent election, Marcos was re-elected in 1969, this time defeating Sergio Osmeña, Jr. Marcos' second term for the presidency, however, was marred by allegations of widespread graft and corruption. The increasing disparity of wealth between the very wealthy and the very poor, which made up the majority of the country's population, led to the rise of crime and civil unrest around the country. These factors, including the formation of the New People's Army, an armed revolt that called for the redistribution of wealth and land reform in the Philippines, and a bloody Muslim separatist movement in the southern island of Mindanao led by the Moro National Liberation Front or MNLF, contributed to the rapid rise of civil discontent and unrest in the Philippines. Marcos was barred from running for a third term as president in 1973, so on September 23, 1972, by virtue of a presidential proclamation, he declared martial law, citing rising civil disobedience as justification. Through this decree, Marcos seized emergency powers, giving him full control of the Philippine military and the authority to suppress the freedom of speech, the freedom of the press, and many other civil liberties. Marcos also dissolved the Philippine Congress and shut down media establishments critical of the Marcos government. Marcos also ordered the immediate arrest of his political opponents and critics. Among those arrested were Senate President Jovito Salonga, Senator Jose Diano, and Senator Benigno Aquino, Jr., the staunchest of his critics and the man who was groomed by the opposition to succeed Marcos after the 1973 elections. Marcos would also abolish the Philippines' 1935 constitution and replace it with a parliamentary-style government along with a new constitution, written by him. With practically all of his political opponents arrested and in exile, Marcos' preemptive declaration of martial law in 1972, and the ratification of his new constitution through political coercion, enabled him to effectively legitimize his government and hold on to power for another 14 years beyond his first 2 terms as president. At a period when the Cold War was still a political reality, Marcos's dictatorship ensured the political support of the United States by Marcos' promise to stamp out communism in the Philippines and by assuring the United States of its continued use of military and naval bases in the Philippines. Throughout his presidency, Ferdinand Marcos had set up a regime in the Philippines that would give him ultimate power over the military and the national treasury, as well as set up a personality cult. Following his declaration of martial law on September 21, 1972, Marcos immediately began to embezzle money from the government and order the military to kill any political competition against him. As a result, the Philippine economy began to tumble greatly, and the nation lost its competitive edge in Southeast Asia. He also ordered many stores, hotels, schools, universities, and other public places to place his presidential picture prominently, or otherwise their facilities were shut down. The media frequently eulogized Marcos through public service announcements and news reports. Even billboard advertisements across the country were replaced with his propaganda messages on justifying his regime's actions. Marcos also ordered the shutdown and takeovers of businesses in the country, then put these businesses either under the government control, or under the control of Marcos' cronies. Several groups of people, however, even within the government, conspired throughout the term of the Marcos regime to overthrow him. They were led by the popular public figure, incarcerated opposition Senator Benigno Ninoy Aquino, Jr., who Marcos accused of leaning to a left-wing solution, while gaining popularity amongst the Filipino people for his stance against Marcos. Aquino was eventually forced to seek exile in the United States for health and safety reasons. However, in 1983, Ninoy Aquino announced his plans to return to the Philippines to challenge the Marcos government. Within the military, disillusioned junior officers silently conveyed their grievances. This led to the formation of the Reform the Armed Forces movement, Soldier of the Filipino People, and Young Officers Union, RAM, which was led by graduates of the Philippine Military Academy class of 71, LT. Col. Gringo Honesan, LT. Col. Victor Batic, and LT. Col. Eduardo Carpunan, found an ally and mentor in the Defense Minister Juan Ponce Enrile. Assassination of Ninoy Aquino. Despite warnings from the military and other pro-Marcos groups, Ninoy Aquino was determined to return to the Philippines. Asked what he thought of the death threats, Ninoy Aquino responded, "The Filipino is worth dying for." On August 21, 1983, after a 3-year exile in the United States, Aquino was assassinated as he was disembarking from a Taiwanese commercial flight at the Manila International Airport. His assassination shocked and outraged many Filipinos, most of whom had lost confidence in the Marcos administration. It also shook the Marcos government, which was by then deteriorating due, in part, to Marcos' worsening health and ultimately fatal illness. The assassination of Ninoy Aquino caused the economy of the country to deteriorate even further, and the government plunged further into debt. By the end of 1983, the country was bankrupt, and the economy contracted by 6.8%. In 1984, Marcos appointed a commission, led by Chief Justice Enrique Fernando, to launch an investigation into Aquino's assassination. Despite the commission's conclusions, Cardinal Jaime Sin, the Archbishop of Manila, declined an offer to join the commission and rejected the government's views on the assassination. By October, Marcos appointed a second commission to investigate. The commission's final report accused the military of staging a conspiracy to assassinate Aquino, dealing another major blow to the already collapsing government. Calls for election. On November 3, 1985, after pressures from Washington, Marcos suddenly announced that a presidential snap election would take place the following year, 1 year ahead of the regular presidential election schedule, to legitimize his control over the country. The snap election was legalized with the passage of Batas Pambansa BLG 883 by the Marcos-controlled unicameral Congress called the Regular Batasang Pambansa. The growing opposition movement encouraged Ninoy Aquino's widow, Corazon Aquino, to run for the presidency with Salvador Laurel as running mate for vice president. Marcos ran for re-election, with Arturo Tolentino as his running mate. The Aquino-Laurel tandem ran under the United Opposition Party, while the Marcos-Tolentino ticket ran under the Kilusang Bagong Lipunan Party. Snap election. The elections were held on February 7, 1986. The official election canvasser, the Commission on Elections, declared Marcos the winner. The final tally of the COMELEC had Marcos winning with 10,807,197 votes against Aquino's 9,291,761 votes. On the other hand, the final tally of the National Movement for Free Elections, an accredited poll watcher, had Aquino winning with 7,835,070 votes against Marcos' 7,053,068 points. This electoral exercise was marred by widespread reports of violence and tampering of election results, culminating in the walkout of 29 COMELEC computer technicians to protest the deliberate manipulation of the official election results to favor Ferdinand Marcos. The walkout was considered as one of the early sparks of the People Power Revolution. The walkout also served as an affirmation to allegations of vote buying, fraud, and tampering of election results by the KBL. Because of reports of alleged fraud, the Catholic Bishops' Conference of the Philippines through Ricardo Cardinal Vidal issued a statement condemning the elections. The United States Senate also passed a resolution stating the same condemnation. U.S. President Ronald Reagan issued a statement calling the fraud reports as disturbing. In response to the protests, COMELEC claimed that Marcos with 53% won over Aquino. However, NAMFREL countered that the latter won over Marcos with 52% of votes. On February 15, Marcos was proclaimed by COMELEC and Batasang Pambansa as the winner amidst the controversy. All 50 opposition members of the parliament walked out in protest. The Filipino people refused to accept the results, however, asserting that Aquino was the real victor. Both winners took their oath of office in two different places, with Aquino gaining greater mass support. Aquino also called for coordinated strikes and mass boycott of the media and businesses owned by Marcos' cronies. As a result, the crony banks, corporations, and media were hit hard, and the shares in the stock market plummeted to record levels. Citation needed. Date equals February 2014. Vidal's condemnation. Cardinal Vidal, after the result of the snap election, issued a declaration in lieu of the Philippine church hierarchy stating that a government does not of itself freely correct the evil it has inflicted on the people, then it is our serious moral obligation as a people to make it do so. The declaration also asked every loyal member of the church, every community of the faithful, to form their judgment about the February 7 polls, and told all the Filipinos, now is the time to speak up. Now is the time to repair the wrong. The wrong was systematically organized. So must its correction be.